Okay, so part two is everyday life, algorithms, and labour. So, in very recent times, sociological perspectives have started to consider how things like algorithms, AI, digital platforms are influencing the way that we live through the lens of how they have very specific forms of power that are kind of relatively new and haven't had to consider them in terms of the way that class works before. And particularly the way that increasingly private companies seem to have as much influence over our lives now as governments. And there's tensions you can see between these kind of huge private companies and governments all the time. So sociology is sometimes a little bit slow to kind of, I think, shine a light on new technologies, but I think that's not so much been the case with the internet and digital technologies more broadly. And this is particularly the case because essentially they've been incorporated into all aspects of our lives. It's very rare now you can kind of think of anything that we do that hasn't had digital technology incorporated in some way. Even, people now that go out hiking in the middle of the woods tend to take kind of GPS kind of tracking with them, or, mobile phones to take cameras or to take photos or whatever. So we experience these effects of digital technologies when we engage with pretty much all institutions, when we get to know people, when we buy things, when we look for information, when you want to kind of get a cab somewhere. Pretty much all aspects of lives now is engaging and done through these technologies. So it's really important to think that they don't not just offer kind of broad opportunities and freedoms and access to things, but they certainly now permit much higher levels of surveillance than we've ever really been under before. The notion of big data, the way that companies collect more and more data on us, every time you kind of sign up for a new thing, every time you buy something, you're essentially just kind of handing over your data. Any platform, any social media company that you sign up for, when you tick that box of the terms and agreements and, don't read the 75 pages of legalese, you're essentially giving away your data in those moments. Some companies, like Apple, have kind of pretended to be more caring about your data, but basically all they've done is stop other companies get your data and then they use it for their own ends. Sociology kind of reckoned with the kind of rise of big data. There was a kind of notion there for a while that maybe sociology was increasingly irrelevant because there was all this data available that people could use more freely. But what we're finding that as that kind of access to that data has become more restricted, sociological studies have become even more important for thinking about the real influence that these companies have over us and the inequalities that they engender. So pretty much all companies, governments are harvesting, mining and storing data as much as they can, using it for various forms of citizen profiling, using it for various forms of social disciplining. The robo-debt, terrible scandal in Australia is a really good example of this. And things like that have been happening all around the world over the past 10 or 20 years. Increasingly what's happening too is that the use of data constructed or collected by these different places, whether it's Facebook selling stuff to an insurance company or an advertiser, or whether it's Spotify, selling your data to advertisers or insurance companies as well, that data is kind of gathered for one particular purpose, but then it's kind of spread around and used by different people, different institutions, different companies in ways that the data isn't actually all that fit for. And therefore this kind of a stretching of the meaning of data that kind of makes it irrelevant, but it's still applied in a way that's kind of seen as legitimate. Again, and this is having real kind of detrimental effects on many people's lives. So if you're interested in these topics, there's a heap of different books about this kind of stuff. Books called, Discriminating Data, Algorithms of Oppression, Weapons of Maths Destruction. I strongly suggest if you're interested in the wider implications of these that you check those books out. A key way of thinking about how we engage with various digital platforms has been the concept of prosumption, a kind of merger of production and consumption into one thing. And this has been particularly a case in the rise of kind of Web 2.0. Much of those new, huge, multinational and dominant platforms are basically relying upon the labour of the users themselves for the platforms to work, for them to gather data, and for people to kind of develop their profiles and activities on those platforms. So things like Google Maps, relies on, people putting information into the system. Amazon relies on, reviews. YouTube is essentially a user system where all the content on it is uploaded by users. Every single click and scroll on Facebook and Instagram is essentially you working for the company for free. You're creating the material, you're doing all the kind of work for them, but you're not getting paid for it. So this is kind of interesting in the sense in terms of the very fundamental understandings of what we mean by work. We go to work in the day, we work for money, and then you could argue that we come home at night and kind of get on our digital platforms and start working for these companies. So the term prosumption is used to indicate the production and consumption of content using digital media, so like a surfer attaching a GoPro to a camera and then uploading it to these sites. Your leisure practice, if you're doing that, is becoming content for these sites to use for their own commercial purposes. But again, your work in that sense means you don't get a cut. So, from a sociological point of view, this is kind of seen as being kind of free labour. What's also referred to as immaterial labour. So, again, you go to work to produce things or services or information, but then in this sense, you're kind of not really producing anything but data, and you're doing it for free for these various accounts and platforms. So the immaterial labour here, on one hand, refers to how the creation, tracking and selling of data information is central to a lot of work, and skills involving cybernetics and computer control are central to the economy. So the idea of free labour in particular was developed through that early kind of 80s and 90s internet where people were kind of online doing this stuff voluntarily, largely because they saw it as a kind of communal space where people would be able to use their services and use their things that they make for free in a kind of exchange and a place where people could go to talk to each other and be themselves. But as these spaces increasingly got enclosed and privatised, some of that kind of labour still was happening, but was starting to be used for profit by the companies that took over those spaces. So this free cultural labour is now kind of something that we all do on a day-to-day basis. What's interesting though is not all of this labour is kind of seen as having the same value. Beverly Skeggs' work, where she and a data scientist called Simon Newell got together and they made a bot where they got 150 volunteers to agree to put the bot on their phone and attached it to the Facebook app. And every time they got on the Facebook app, the bot could track, how Facebook was tracking them. And they found that people are valued very differently by these things. So, for instance, one of the examples I used was a kind of young, attractive white girl in the US who was online a lot. Facebook was tracking her 12 hours a day. And the reason for that is she was kind of seen as kind of good-looking, cool, edgy. Her tastes matched the kind of advertising that Facebook wanted to do. But there was also a kind of older, poorer black woman who wasn't seen as good value. Facebook tracked her much less, and the advertising that sends people like that, things like cheap supermarkets or dodgy credit. So you can see already the way that these kind of machines are replicating normal inequalities in that sense. So immaterial labour, we all kind of do it, but it's not valued the same by the companies, and we're all valued differently. We're put in different categories. Again, I'll show you this towards the end of the lecture. But all our activities that we're doing online, whether it's kind of reviewing stuff, clicking on things, talking to each other, things we buy, our tastes, our music habits, and all this kind of stuff are kind of hugely valuable to these companies. And the ethics of this in the last 10 years in particular have fundamentally changed. As recently, the CEO of Spotify, Daniel Ek, spent 600 million of his own money to start funding, war drones, essentially, a private company that makes war drones. So essentially what this means is that our subscriptions and our activities on Spotify are funding military technology now. So historically, stuff like this has always been the case. Huge multinational companies have always been kind of vertically and horizontally integrated in various practices and with each other. Classic example of this is, IBM providing the technology for the Nazi German government to kind of track, who they were going to kill. There's an incredible book about that if you're interested in that. So these kind of technologies and, the owners of companies have always kind of in some way or another had unethical practices. But this kind of more privatized version of it, where it's individuals rather than companies get to do this kind of stuff, feels a little bit more pernicious. It feels more abstracted, more kind of like a kind of threat, I suppose. Importantly, though, as the internet has risen and as digital companies have privatized these spaces, legal forms and social relations in particular have changed to kind of accept this. It's really interesting in terms of what privacy and private property, how it's changed over the years in relation to these kind of social changes. And this is also the case with, the way that kind of AI companies, for instance, can just like use libgem to kind of download, millions of books to feed into their AI machines. But if like, individuals like me or you get busted doing something like that, we're likely to be fined or prosecuted. So you can see here that like there's kind of new formations of power, but they kind of reflect old formations of power as well. So inequality is certainly a key way of looking at this new digital age. And it's been kind of theorized through the notion of the digital divide. Certainly shouldn't be assumed that everyone in the world has equal access to digital media. The poor people, people living in remote places, older people, small children, inhabitants of countries that censor internet usage, or people in prison and stuff like that have little or no access. So you can see again the usual contours of inequalities and difference in society apply here. There's also kind of the various kind of communication problems. Anyone that's tried to help their grandparents or whatever with using the internet or whatever, you can probably see some key differences there. There's an alternate way of looking at this as well, though, but like for things like in African countries that never really got old school phones, they kind of skipped that technology and just went straight into mobile phone use. And so things like those kind of technologies in some ways have been progressive there, but also relate to some of the problems we're talking about as well. So there's key digital divides in education systems. You're increasingly going to need to have the latest technologies. With the rise of AI now, universities are going to want to kind of maybe view you on your screen while you do exams or essays. There's all kinds of pressures, therefore, to keep up, to have the latest devices. And obviously that's not always the case that people have the means to be able to do that. But access is definitely not the only issue here. And it's much as like, while, having, the latest gear and the latest programs and the latest technology is kind of increasingly important to be able to get by in society and like get ahead, it's not just access to these things. Definitely the notion of digital social inequality is kind of a better and more broad way to think about inequality than the digital divide. Because this is particularly the different ways that people use these technologies, and the corollary of that is the different way people are treated online. Gender, age, race, ethnicity, and all these kind of things still are hugely important in terms of the way that people experience digital life. So, in terms of the question of democracy and rise of kind of spread of information, it's often been stated that the internet is democratic. Of course, you kind of have kind of free access to it, but increasingly that's not the case. There's more and more paywalls. Certainly, people can get on there and have a go, but most news sites and various social media sites require registration, payments of fees, restricting access. In Australia, social media has just been banned for under 16, so it's hardly democratic and broad-ranging there. There's the increasing personal risk of being hacked and being exposed to fraud. And, as I was talking about already, the kind of increasing co-optation and colonisation of people's work, their creativity, their art, and stuff like that being encapsulated by these things without them being compensated for it. And of course, the so-called dark web allows people access, the first time really in human history that people just kind of have access to this kind of stuff at the tip of their fingers, such as child porn and things that encourage suicide, or things that encourage kind of eating disorders. All this kind of stuff operates through the internet, fairly easy to access, and again, these are good examples of the various kind of risks and affordances of how the web works. Okay, I'll leave part 2 there and come back for the third part of the lecture to talk about memes and GIFs.